In November 2013, Xi Jinping, General Secretary of Chinese Communist Party, CCP, launched the manifesto for his decade in power. No one then anticipated a third term, at the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee. The decision on major issues concerning comprehensively deepening reforms was intended to be an epoch-defining set of changes. It needed to be, because the CCP leadership had concluded that the economic and social model followed since the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee in 1978 was unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. When Jiabao, former premier of the People's Republic of China, PRC, had used this phrase in 2007, Xi Jinping repeated it in his remarks on the 2013 decision, and even as recently as last year. If the economic and social model was indeed unsustainable, then the purpose of the third plenum in 2013 was to reverse out of the cul-de-sac and find an alternative route forwards. This begs the question of whether the intervening decade has defined and implemented the reforms outlined to a degree such that a new model, or a new development concept, as Xi Jinping likes to say, has successfully been put in place. Such success or failure in turn begs the question of what role an economy-focused plenum 10 years later can play in reinforcing success or rectifying failure. Title II: The Third Plenum of 2013, Comprehensively Deepening Reform. In the 2013 Third Plenum documents, Xi Jinping set out a highly ambitious and wide-ranging reform program. He dealt not just with the economy. As Xi Jinping himself set out in his 2013 explanation concerning the CCP Central Committee resolution concerning some major issues in comprehensively deepening reform, the decision itself had 16 chapters, which he divided into 7 areas. Economic reform was clearly the most important. But the other 6 elements both underpinned economic reform and reflected Xi Jinping's wider ambitions. It is worth briefly highlighting the more important of the other elements, before moving on to the 4 bones of economic reform. An enduring preoccupation of Xi Jinping has been law-based governance. This was the theme of the 4th plenum in 2014. Professionalizing the law, broadening and systematizing its application, but above all building trust in it as the legal basis for economic and other activity represent important aims. Without impartial law to protect entrepreneurs and build trust in the system, the energies of private enterprise are likely to be blunted. However, building protection and trust is undermined by the CCP declaration that the party itself is above the law. While the party wishes to keep politics and national security for its, and not the courts, discretion, both can be used by local officials or business rivals as cover to disadvantage private sector companies and competitors. Important too in 2013 was the intention to strengthen CCP control over the military. Xi Jinping's 7 areas of reform were broken down into 5+1+1, the ones being the military and CCP construction. This was the first time that military matters appeared as a separate topic at such a plenum. Since 2015, Xi Jinping has greatly transformed control of the People's Liberation Army, PLA, by revamping the Central Military Commission and the area commands. He has also replaced most commanders with those whom he trusts. Particular emphasis was placed on party building and discipline/corruption. Under the leading small group on comprehensively deepening reform, whose establishment was announced at the 3rd plenum, were 6 other special groups covering the economy, ecology, democracy and the legal system, culture, the social system, party building and discipline inspection. The importance of the last was shown because the Disciplinary Inspection System Reform Group is listed separately and, in the list of members of the Deep Reform Team, 5 deputy secretaries of the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection participated, more than any other unit. This is hardly surprising, since corruption had reached horrific levels such that when Jiabao said that it could threaten the CCP's hold on power, how could reform, which must involve upfront expenditure before gains could be made, proceed if so much money was disappearing into cadres' pockets? Finally, it is worth noting that in the case of social issues, the 3rd plenum was not just about reforms to improve the people's lot, but also about tightening control and practices which had grown flabby under the leadership of Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Those who at the time hoped that Xi Jinping might be of a liberal persuasion clearly had not read the October 2011 6th plenum, whose decision presaged the Xi Jinping-era controls over the media, education, the internet, religion, civil society, and more. While Xi Jinping was in charge of the drafting committee for the 2011 6th plenum decision, preparation for the promised tightening of control had started before he came to power. In other words, to avoid the risk of losing power, CCP leaders had earlier decided to restore a muscular Leninism, even if Xi Jinping subsequently took it further than many may have anticipated. The third plenum reforms were to be completed in 7 years, by 2020, in time to meet the first centennial goal of achieving a moderately prosperous society. By 2020, the reform tasks put forward in this decision are to be completed within this period, and institutions and systems that are structurally complete, scientifically standardized and effective in operation are to be formed, to ensure that institutions in all areas become more mature and complete. A government report on a 31 December 2020 Tea Party of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, at which Xi Jinping spoke, claimed that more than 7 years after the third plenary session of the 18th Central Committee was held, a total of 2,485 reform programs have been launched by various parties, and the reform targets and tasks have generally been completed as scheduled. Such a claim sits ill with many other CCP pronouncements on the need for reform made since 2020. Title 2.1 limits on reform of the PRC's birdcage economy at the 2013 Third Plenum. In the PRC's Leninist system, economic reform is necessarily circumscribed. The best-known sentence from the Third Plenum is, ensuring that the market has a decisive role in the allocation of resources and giving better rein to the functions of government. This was a major theoretical viewpoint in this plenum resolution. Most commentators have focused on the decisive role, a step up from earlier language of basic role, but failed to consider the significance of strengthening the government role. Yet Xi Jinping was clear: give rein to the positive role of the party and the government. The market has a decisive role in resource allocation, but it does not have the total role. How could it in a Leninist system? In the famous document number 9, which prescribed 7 Western influences, the fourth "Don't speak" inveighs against the promotion of neoliberalism, which attempts to change the PRC's basic economic system. Neoliberalism's advocates actively promote the market omnipotence theory. They claim our country's macroeconomic control is strangling the market's efficiency and vitality, and they oppose public ownership, arguing that China's state-owned enterprises are national monopolies, inefficient and disruptive of the market economy, and should undergo comprehensive privatization. These arguments aim to change our country's basic economic infrastructure and weaken the government's control of the national economy. No self-respecting Leninist can let go of the main economic levers, since the accumulation of wealth could lead to demands for political power. No taxation without representation echoes beyond North America of the 18th century. The CCP runs a birdcage economy, the words of Chen Yun, former vice premier of the PRC who led on economic policy. The question at issue has always been the size of the cage allowed by Leninism. Title 3: 4 crucial areas of reform. Amongst the myriad of 2013 reforms of the economic system, 4 areas stand out. Number 1, the system of administration and authorizations, which impinges upon the private sector. Number 2, SOEs. Number 3, finance and taxation, and Number 4, the connected issues of the hukou system and rural land reform, which affect labor mobility and common prosperity. These are the pillars of reform set out in a book published in March 2017, which assessed reform progress after 3 years. The authors worked for the Institute of Economic System and Management, IESM, a think tank under the National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC. Since the NDRC is charged with planning and implementing reform, their views are likely to carry weight. The book considered reform under the 4 headings above. A 5th was health reform, but, while important, this does not underpin other wider economic reforms. The authors were remarkably candid about the failure to reform after 3 years. It is unlikely that they would be so today, in the era of Xi Jinping's positive energy. Title 3.1.1 Administration and Authorizations. Administration and authorizations encapsulate the intention that, as the Third Plenum decision put it, we will persist in equality of rights, opportunities and rules, abolish all forms of irrational regulations for the non-public economy, remove all hidden barriers, and adopt specific measures for non-public enterprises to enter franchising fields. Despite 30 years of reform and relative encouragement of the private sector, it was still besieged by red tape, arbitrary interference, unreliable recourse to legal redress, locally imposed taxes, charges, fines, and much more. In 2017, the NDRC's IESM listed some success in tackling the problems of red tape and interference. 618 provisions had been cancelled or remitted to lower levels of government, and the central government level had passed down 40% out of a total of 200 powers. But that was the extent of its optimism. Among other problems, it noted that: Number 1, there was no legislation to back up the measures. Number 2, movement was government-driven rather than by enterprises or their people, and therefore was often inappropriate. Number 3, many provisions had been abolished only in name. Number 4, lower levels did not have competent or technically qualified personnel to manage matters at their level. Number 5, powers had not been adequately defined. Number 6, the new systems necessary for the exercise of powers were not in place, and Number 7, organizations were not sharing information and resources which would allow enterprises a one-stop shop for efficient registration and operation. The claim made in 2020 that reform targets and tasks have generally been completed as scheduled fails to convince in the light of subsequent remarks from CCP leaders. In his government work report, GWR, to the National People's Congress in 2023, Li Keqiang, former premier of the PRC, claimed that over the years, we have cancelled or delegated to lower-level authorities the power of administrative approval for over 1,000 items and slashed the number of investment items subject to central government approval by over 90%. But it is not just the central government which presents a problem to the private sector. Local government, to whom many approval powers were delegated, has continued to interfere. It is clear from the section in the 2021 GWR on advancing reforms in key areas and further energizing market entities that reforms set out in 2013 had not been completed by the 2020 deadline, because a year later Li was still outlining the necessity of implementing these measures. We will build a cordial and clean relationship between government and business, remove barriers to the development of private businesses, and promote an entrepreneurial spirit. The 2022 GWR largely repeats this. Even in 2023, at the July Politburo meeting on the economy, work remained to be done to provide private enterprises with an enabling environment, and in particular firm actions must be taken to crack down on arbitrary charges, fines and quotas, and get outstanding payments owed by governments to enterprises cleared. Because of the impoverishment of local government, these extortions have risen in recent years. Additionally, the high-profile treatment dished out to Alibaba, as well as to other leading private companies, enforced charitable donations, the third distribution mechanism, a fine euphemism, and the establishment and strengthening of CCP cells or branches inside companies have all sent discouraging messages to entrepreneurs about the balance between market and government. Morale and investment appear low. Another problem was regional protectionism. Counties and provinces made it difficult for businesses to sell or expand across local boundaries. Local governments favored their own and kept outsiders away. This problem was recognized in 2013. A unified national economy remains a key concern of Xi Jinping. Hence the emphasis then on the setting up of the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei Zone, Jingjinji. The People's Daily published an article stating that it is unprecedented for the General Secretary of the party to preside over the meeting to study the coordinated development of a region. The Beijing-Tianjin-Hebei Coordinated Development Leading Group will take the lead in making breakthroughs in three key areas: transportation integration, ecological environment protection, and industrial coordinated development. Subsequently, the CCP set up the integration of the Yangtze River Delta, the Yangtze River Economic Belt, the Chengdu-Chongqing Economic Circle, and Greater Bay Area in southern PRC. But clearly progress in breaking down regional obstructionism was slow. In 2018, the Central Committee published opinions on establishing a more effective new mechanism for regional coordinated development. Shortly afterwards, it set up the Central Regional Coordinated Development Leading Group, whose existence only came to light in September 2023. That progress has lagged is confirmed by Xi Jinping's call at the 9 September 2020 meeting of the Central Finance and Economics Commission that it was necessary to accelerate the improvement of the domestic unified large market. Title 3.1.2 State-Owned Enterprise Reform. There was never any doubt in 2013 that SOEs would retain their central role in the economy. We must unswervingly consolidate and develop the public economy, persist in the dominant position of public ownership, give full play to the leading role of the state-owned sector, and continuously increase its vitality, controlling force and influence. The aims of these reforms were to regularize decision-making over operations, grow the value of state assets, set up a level playing field with other enterprises, raise production efficiency, strengthen vitality, and meet their social obligations. Through the setting up of state investment companies, investment was to be directed to important sectors of the economy, national defense, the environment, strategic and emerging industries. SOEs would work under different conditions depending on whether they provided services, were monopolies, or could be exposed to market competition. There was to be greater professionalism, regularized salaries, not least to stop managers milking SOEs, and transparency. Central SOEs would be consolidated, while some local SOEs might succumb to competitors. Under mixed ownership reforms, private sector investment in SOEs and vice versa were to be encouraged to promote an exchange of good business practice. In sum, there was a strong emphasis on separating SOE management from government oversight. As much as possible, they would be run on proper commercial lines, not as administrative adjuncts of government. By 2017, reform had not progressed as planned. The IESM was not complementary. Despite the August 2015 guiding principles on SOE reform and 13 supplementary documents, there had been little implementation for 6 main reasons. Number 1, rampant vested interests, not just in SOEs, but in central ministries and the NDRC, meant no unity and weak design at the central level. 2, the Central Committee failed to appreciate the concerns at local levels and how SOEs actually operated. 3, proposals were not sufficiently scientific, e.g., salary reductions killed managers' enthusiasm. 4, instructions on implementation were insufficiently clear and detailed. 5, fear among implementers. No one wanted to take responsibility, not least for disposing of or reassigning assets, and 6, local governments looked to their own interests and were unwilling to take action, not least if it might mean missing job evaluation targets, such as for employment or gross domestic product. They therefore worked with SOEs to ensure little change and few cuts. In 2020, the Central Committee and State Council promulgated opinions on speeding up and perfecting the socialist market economic system in the new era. The first substantive section, adhere to public ownership as the main body in the common development of various ownership economies, and enhance the vitality of micro-entities, makes it clear that, although SOE reform should have been completed by 2020, little progress had been made in its essence, namely the better use of state capital, mixed ownership reforms, and the altering of natural monopoly industries. This still appears to be the case. Lee's 2021 GWR gave an unconvincing assessment. We will continue to implement the 3-year action plan for SOE reform, and work to strengthen, expand, and increase the returns on state capital and enhance the strength, quality, and size of SOEs. We will also push ahead with mixed ownership reform in SOEs. The 2022 GWR was no more positive. Nor was Xi Jinping himself, speaking at this July's first meeting of the Central Commission for Comprehensively Deepening Reform under the 20th CCP Central Committee. Efforts should be done to deepen reform of state-owned enterprises and focus on addressing inadequacies, strengthening weak areas, consolidating fundamentals, and giving full play to strengths so as to build a management system of the state-owned sector that has top-level coordination, clear rights and responsibilities, efficient operation and powerful supervision. Recall that this is a decade after reforms were announced and 3 years after the deadline for completion. Title 3.1.3 Financial and Fiscal Reform. Finance is the foundation and an important pillar of state governance, so declared the introduction to Section V of the decision of 2013's third plenum. As Lou Jiwei, former Minister of Finance, stressed in 2015. Only by achieving fundamental breakthroughs in the reform of the fiscal and taxation systems can we provide the material foundation and institutional guarantee for realizing the modernization of national governance and the 2 centenary goals. Liu affirmed that it was not just a question of tinkering with the system and mechanisms. Reform was to be divided into 3 parts. Number 1, establishing a comprehensive, standardized, open and transparent modern budget system. Number 2, establishing and improving a tax system conducive to scientific development, social equity, and market unity, and Number 3, adjusting the fiscal relationship between the central and local governments, and establishing a system in which administrative powers and expenditure responsibilities are compatible. The June 2014 Overall Plan for Deepening the Reform of the Fiscal and Taxation System set a deadline for basic completion by 2016, while also stating that a modern fiscal system will be basically established in 2020. Liu was clear that the task would be tough to fulfill. He reiterated several times the CCP cliché of crossing the river by feeling the stones. The opinion of the NDRC's IESM in 2017 was that while the reform of the budgetary system had largely been implemented, the other two tasks had made slow progress. Surprisingly hard-hitting though the NDRC IESM is, slow progress is an overstatement. There has been some feeling of stones, but little crossing of rivers. Thus, real estate tax, long talked of, has not arrived. Shanghai and Chongqing have carried out Shurdian experimental zones, and the necessary preliminary of registering ownership of property is, apparently, largely complete. But a decade on from the 2013 reforms, the tax remains unimposed, and last year further experiments were put on hold. In practical terms, a property tax is not difficult to implement, hiding ownership is hard. But in political terms, it is. How many CCP officials and their families have multiple properties, which their salaries cannot possibly have afforded? And how would the people react to what in effect is a tax on their savings, so much of which has been put in property, and which is now falling in value? What about the impact on the already troubled property companies? The CCP's motto for economic progress has long been amidst stability seek progress, but stability, i.e., the party's political security, always comes first. Nor has income tax reform helped national finances. Income tax makes up around 6% of the state's revenue, compared to an average of 23.5% in countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in 2016. The opinions of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China and the State Council on Accelerating the Improvement of the Socialist Market Economic System in the New Era, released on 18 May 2020, show that no progress had been made. It recognized a need to deepen the reform of the tax system, improve the direct tax system and gradually increase its proportion, establish and improve a comprehensive and classified personal income tax system. The 2023 NDRC Work Report promised to improve local tax systems and the individual income tax system. This again shows how little has been done in the last decade. The other major task listed in the 2020 opinions was to optimize the division of administrative and financial powers among governments, establish central and local fiscal relations with clear powers and responsibilities, coordinated financial resources, and balanced regional arrangements, and form a stable system in which the administrative powers, expenditure responsibilities, and financial resources of governments at all levels are compatible. Yet, that task is merely a repeat of the reforms set out at the third plenum of 2013 and in the 2014 plan, which aim to correct the problems caused by local governments being responsible for around 85% of expenditure on social services, while receiving only just over 50% of revenue, the rest going to central government. The 2013 decision talks of dividing responsibilities into three categories of central, joint center/local, and local. Responsibility for expenditure would be delineated accordingly. As the IESM put it, the August 2016 guiding principles for the division of central and local government responsibilities and revenues contained no practical implementing regulations. Nor has the situation improved. In sum, much of financial and fiscal reform is, as the IESM summarized it, loud thunder, sparse rain. Title 3.1.4 Labor Mobility, Hukou and Rural Land Reform. The Hukou, household registration system, is an important feature of a Chinese citizen's life. Everyone is registered to a particular city, town, or rural area, and that locality is responsible for supplying their basic services such as education, health, retirement, or unemployment insurance. Changing the location of one's Hukou has never been easy. This is a brake on urbanization, labor mobility, and productivity, as well as a cause of hardship and discontent. Those classified as rural migrants do not enjoy the Hukou of their city of residence. They can only access medical treatment or education where they are registered, usually back in their villages. They are second-class citizens. Services are far better in the major cities, but they are not sufficient to cover all comers. Those enjoying an urban hukou resent rural migrants taking up scarce places in good schools or beds in hospitals, and there have been protests. Given that 70% of the PRC's children are in the countryside, this is a severe restraint on bright children picking up the skills needed in a high-tech economy. The 2013 decision speaks of granting the hukou at 4 different speeds. We will introduce new population management methods, accelerate the reform of household registration system, completely lift restrictions on new residence registration in administrative townships and small cities, relax restrictions on new residence registration in medium-sized cities in an orderly manner, lay down appropriate conditions for new residence registration in large cities, and strictly control the population size of megacities. Attempts to reform the hukou system began well before the third plenum of 2013. Unifying rural and urban labor standards also appears in the 2003 third plenum decision and in 2008. The 12th five-year plan released in March 2011, the product of long preparation, was the first specifically to mention household registration reform in a standalone chapter on urbanization. The hukou problem is intimately linked with rural land reform. Migrant workers would protest if they were deprived of their land use rights, since the land represents an insurance policy if times turn hard in the city, they have something to return to, which would ward off privation, even starvation. Yet the land is often not being properly used and farms can be too small, all at a time when food security is a major policy preoccupation. Again, the IESM reveals that by 2017 progress was minimal. It highlighted a lack of a clear policy direction, provisions which only touched the surface of the problem. Decreeing the abolition of the hukou was one thing, providing equal access to benefits for all was quite another. Land reform had not taken place, not least because without financial and fiscal reform local governments continued to rely on exploiting rural land for revenue. Nor did they have the money to underwrite the provisions of Social Security. Granting the hukou to one person in the Haidian district of Beijing would cost around £1,110,600. Too many organizations were involved in the hukou, each with their own vested interests. Those bigger cities which had instituted a points system for qualification for an urban hukou kept the target too high. The IESM lists solutions, but they involve large sums of money, the politically delicate question of land reform, a solution to the division of costs and revenues between central and local governments, allowing local governments flexibility, and breaking up the vested interests of organizations and ministries. Progress since has been labored. In 2019, Liu, by then ex-Minister of Finance, described the current household registration system as a major and unreasonable institutional issue. He went on, due to the differences in basic public services between urban and rural areas, between regions, between large and medium-sized cities, and the difficulties in the free flow of people, the reform is difficult. He laid much of the blame on the failure to implement land reform. The rural labor force should flow freely and should not be treated differently from urban workers. The land should be freely traded under the control of use. The NDRC report to the NPC in March 2023 promised to speed up the work of expanding permanent urban residency and associated social services to migrants. We will steadily advance people-centered new urbanization. We will work faster to grant permanent urban residency to eligible people who move from rural to urban areas, advance reform of the household registration system in a prudent and orderly manner, promote equitable access to basic public services in cities, and step up efforts to provide people who move from rural to urban areas with basic public services such as employment assistance, skills training, and social security. Other plans and announcements throughout 2023 also show that hukou reform has a long way to go 3 years after it should have been completed. In July, the Zhejiang government published its plan for widening the hukou by 2027. Zhejiang province is the experimental zone for the Common Prosperity Policy, which aims to reduce inequalities, so other areas are likely to be further behind. In August, the Ministry of Public Security announced new measures aiming to promote the complete abolition of settlement restrictions in cities with a permanent urban population of less than 3 million, fully relax the settlement requirements for Type I large cities with an urban permanent population of 3 to 5 million, and improve the point-based settlement policy for super-large cities with an urban permanent population of more than 5 million. Ensure that the social insurance payment period and the residence period score account for the main proportion, and encourage the cancellation of the annual settlement quota limit. Jiangsu Province also released draft measures eliminating hukou restrictions everywhere except in its 2 major cities. All this represents an advance in intention. But, as ever, implementation is all and deadlines are distant. Title 4.0. Do the 3 UNS still apply? For all Xi Jinping's claim that 2,485 reforms had been launched, without reform of the above 4 main pillars, the Chinese economic and social model remains uncoordinated, unbalanced and unsustainable, and, like Wen Jiabao, it is tempting to add unstable. This would suggest that this year there needs to be a third plenum as momentous as its 2013 predecessor was intended to be. Title 4.1 Reform amidst high winds, choppy waters and even dangerous storms. Since 2013, both the internal and external environment for reform have taken a turn for the worse. Internally, the chickens of the system's inadequacy have come home to roost. The problems of debt, local government financing, the real estate sector, and a failure to rebalance investment, exports and consumption, all stem from the current unsustainable model. Other problems, such as demographic decline, unemployment, an inadequately educated workforce, and a skills mismatch may also have been exacerbated by mistakes, systemic delays or difficulties in implementing policies. A long-term water scarcity crisis threatens provinces containing over half of the PRC's agriculture, industry, power generation and population. Externally, free and open countries have awoken to the threat which the CCP's model and its ambitions pose. A willingness to help or to tolerate its effects is changing to a determination to minimize that threat. CCP rhetoric has changed accordingly. The major difficulties, prominent challenges and contradictions, the deep water zone of Xi Jinping's 2013 explanation have moved through gnawing hard bones to high winds, choppy waters, and even dangerous storms. Reform is destabilizing at the best of times. It is one thing to reform when optimism abounds, resources plentiful and problems smaller, quite another when the economy is in trouble. In 2014, Zhang Gaoli, then a Politburo Standing Committee member, rightly echoed the British historian, Thomas Carlyle, "We should face the morning light as we carry out China's reform, not dream as we face the sunset." This year's plenum is certainly late in the day. Title 4.2 Bumping up against the limits of Leninism, no political reform. Some credit the CCP with a reputation for flexibility. This was easier to justify as it cut away from the straitjacket of Maoism. Both Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin were able to make economic gains while relaxing, but still staying inside ideological boundaries. But by the time of Hu Jintao, the strains were showing. The CCP feared that further political, social, and some elements of economic laxity would threaten its hold on power. Xi Jinping was chosen as leader because the CCP saw him as the person to restore discipline and control. The last decade has seen the return of Marxist ideology, centralization, partification, strengthening of the CCP in all organizations and sectors, and the prioritization of national security over economic performance. Of the 16 elements of national security, political, i.e., CCP, security is the most important. This is detrimental to initiative, experimentation, and innovation in governance. Xi Jinping's belief, or bet, is that the PRC can thrive economically and socially under a political model of totalitarian control, and that the CCP can continue to eschew political reform. He will persist in running the PRC's enormous economy and population through top-down command, inspection, and campaigns. Considerable energy and time will have to be spent on party discipline, activities, and study. Such a political model dispenses with 4 elements which could help make the model more self-regulating. Number 1, an independent press, to stimulate ideas and policies, highlight abuses of power and promote discipline in government. Number 2, an independent judiciary, to engender trust both in business and in wider society. Number 3, civil society, to raise ideas and pressure, both rarely come from government officials in any political system, and Number 4, some form of political accountability, real democracy, to encourage rulers to serve the people more effectively rather than their own or the CCP's interests. These four elements are anathema to Xi Jinping, and almost certainly to whomever succeeds him, since allowing them to flourish would lead either to the CCP losing power or having to transform itself, perhaps in the way in which the Kuomintang, KMT, did in Taiwan. Title 5: The 2023 Third Plenum Delayed, Expectations for Reform? According to the constitution of the CCP, it is for the Politburo to convene a plenum and at least one must be held annually. Against expectations, the Politburo meetings of September and October did not announce a date for a third plenum. If the third plenum is to be held in 2023, it will now have to be in December, given that the Politburo meets monthly and at the end of the month. Yet this would bump up against the important annual Central Economic Work Conference, which usually takes place around 10th December. Since the second plenum took place in February, as usual just before the convening of the National People's Congress, there is no requirement to hold the third plenum this year, if Xi Jinping so decides. It is also possible that the third plenum might not center on the economy, as happened, if unusually, in 2018. Xi Jinping may, for example, wish to align an economy-focused plenum with the adoption of the next five-year plan, due in 2025. But whenever a plenum centered on the economy does take place, despite the need for new measures to help the PRC through current turbulence, it is hard to expect much more than the repetition of the reform rhetoric of the last few years. Talk of action over the four pillars of reform, of unifying the market, of reducing inequalities, Xi Jinping's common prosperity agenda, will abound. But, to take the example of SOE reform, it is hard to conceive of breakthroughs beyond the latest three-year plan, which is due to be completed shortly. The bars of Chen's ideological birdcage for the economy are not going to be removed. The underlying reason is ultimately a refusal to countenance meaningful reform of the political system. One thing which is likely to be seen is yet more emphasis on innovation, science and technology as the way of cutting the political and economic Gordian knot. This has been a constant theme from Xi Jinping, and very large sums of money have been dedicated to innovation, with some impressive results. But the jury remains out on whether this will be sufficient to make up for the negatives of an otherwise unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable system. Top-down innovation, funded and directed from the center, can only go so far. Political control reinforces cultural biases against iconoclasm or the freedom to wander down paths unauthorized, which are major contributors to innovation, whether in technology or governance. Another factor is the skills mismatch. Currently, high-tech companies cannot find sufficiently expert staff, yet youth unemployment exceeds 20%, a long-term problem resulting from insufficient investment in basic education, something exacerbated by the failure to reform the hukou system. Title 5.1 Longer-term expectations. The CCP has long declared its second centenary goal, by the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PRC in 2049, as the establishment of its strong, democratic, civilized, harmonious, and modern socialist country. Translated from party speak, this means supplanting the United States as the preeminent superpower and making global governance the handmaid of the PRC's own interests and values. Increasingly, too, Xi Jinping has talked about Chinese modernization setting, a good example for developing countries to move towards modernization independently, and has provided them with a new choice. In the years before COVID-19, many assumed that the PRC would inevitably become the world's biggest economy and most powerful nation. This author has long doubted that. Now the optimism of others has curdled into warnings of stagnation or even collapse. Talk is of peak China. This is the wrong geological metaphor. Peaks rise and fall sharply. The CCP's economic and social model, by its own admission, is unsustainable without reform. Nevertheless, even without reform, the likelihood is that the PRC will remain a powerful force over the coming decades. It has plateaued, but plateaus can stretch considerable distances, although it is true that sometimes they descend precipitately at the far end. For the sake of the Chinese people and indeed global economic interdependencies, the hope must be that the descent from the plateau is gradual.